On the 7th of November, sight of the westward range having been temporarily lost, we passed Franklin Island and the next day descried the cones of mountains Erebus and Terror of Ross Island ahead, with a long line of Imperial Mountains beyond. They're now stretched to the east, the low white line of the Great Ice Barrier, rising perpendicularly to a height of 200 feet like the rocky cliffs of Quebec, and marking the end of southward navigation. In the afternoon, we entered McMurdo Sound and stood off on the coast in the lee of smoking Mount Erebus. The Scoriac Peak towered up some 12,700 feet against the eastern sky. Like a Japanese print of sacred Fujiyama, while beyond it rose the white ghost-like height of Mount Terror, 10,900 feet in altitude, and now extinct as a volcano. Puffs of smoke from Erebus came intermittently, and one of the graduate assistants, a brilliant young fellow named Danforth, pointed out what looked like lava on the snowy slope. Remarking that this mountain, discovered in 1840, had undoubtedly been the source of Poe's image when he wrote 7 years later of the lavas that restlessly roll their sulphurous currents down Yannick in the ultimate climbs of the pole, that groan as they roll down Mount Yannick in the realms of the boreal pole. Danforth was a great reader of bizarre material and had talked a great deal of Poe. I was interested myself because of the Antarctic scene of Poe's only long story, the disturbing and enigmatical Arthur Gordon Pym. On the barren shore, on the lofty ice barrier on the background, myriads of grotesque penguins squawked and flapped their fins, while many fat seals were visible in the water, swimming or sprawling across large cakes of slowly drifting ice. Using the small boats, we effected a difficult landing on Ross Island shortly after midnight on the morning of the 9th, carrying a line of cable from each of the ships and preparing to unload supplies by means of a breeches buoy arrangement. Our sensations on first treading Antarctic soil were poignant and complex, even though at this point in particular, the Scott and Shackleton expeditions had preceded us. The camp on the frozen shore below the volcano slope was the only provisional one. Headquarters being kept aboard the Arkham, we landed our drilling apparatus, dogs, sledges, tents, provisions, gasoline tanks, experimental ice melting outfit, cameras, both ordinary and aerial, airplane parts, and other accessories, including some 3 small portable wireless outfits, besides those in the planes, capable of communicating with the Arkham's large outfit from any point, part of the Antarctic continent that we'd be likely to visit. The ship's outfit, communicating with the outside world, was to convey press reports to the Arkham advertisers at the powerful wireless station at Kingsport Head, Massachusetts. We hoped to complete our work during a single Antarctic summer, but if this proved impossible, we would winter on the Arkham, sending the Miskatonic north before the freezing of the ice for another summer supply. I need not repeat what the newspapers have already published about our early work of our ascent on Mount Erebus. Our successful mineral borings in several points on Ross Island and the singular speed with which Habity's apparatus accomplished them. through solid rock layers, our provisional test of the small ice melting equipment, our perilous ascent of the Great Barrier with sledges and supplies, and our final assembling of the 5 huge airplanes at the camp atop the barrier. The health of our land party, 25 men and 55 Alaskan sledge dogs, was remarkable, though of course we had so far encountered no really destructive temperatures or windstorms. For the most part, the thermometer varied between 0 and 20 degrees or 25 degrees above. And our experience with New England winters had accustomed us to rigors of this sort. The barrier camp was semi-permanent and destined to be a storage cache for gasoline, provisions, dynamite, and other supplies. Only 4 of our planes were needed to carry the actual exploring material, the 5th being left with the pilot and 2 men from the ship at the storage cache to form a means of reaching us from the Arkham in case all our exploring planes were lost. Later, when not using all the other planes for moving apparatus, we would employ 1 or 2 in a shuttle transportation service between this cache and another permanent base on the Great Plateau from 600 to 700 miles southward, beyond Beardmore Glacier. Despite the almost unanimous accounts of appalling winds and tempests that poured down from the plateau, we determined to dispense with intermediate bases, taking our chances in the interest of economy and probable efficiency. Wireless reports have spoken of the breathtaking 4-hour non-stop flight of our squadron on November 21st over the lofty Scheldt ice, with vast peaks rising on the west and the unfathomed silences echoing to our sound, the sound of our engines. Wind troubled us only moderately, and our radio compasses helped us through the one opaque fog we encountered. When the vast rise loomed ahead between latitudes 83 and 84 degrees, we knew we had reached Beardmore Glacier, the largest valley glacier in the world, and that the frozen sea was now giving place to a frowning and mountainous coastline. At last we were truly entering the white, eon-dead world of the ultimate South. And even as we realized, we saw the peak of Mount Nansen in the eastern distance, towering up to its height of almost 50,000 feet. The successful establishment of the southern base above the glacier in latitude 86 by 7, east longitude 174 degrees by 23, and the phenomenally rapid and effective borings and blastings made at various points reached by our sledge trips and short airplane flights are matters of history, as is the arduous and triumphant ascent of Mount Nansen by Pabodie and 2 of his graduate students, Gedney and Carroll, on December 13th to the 15th. We were some 8,500 feet above sea level, and when experimental drillings revealed solid ground only 12 feet down through the snow and ice at certain points, we made considerable use of small melting apparatus and sunk bores and performed dynamiting in many places where no previous explorer had thought of securing mineral specimens. The Precambrian granites and Beacon sandstones thus obtained confirmed our belief that this plateau was homogeneous with this great bulk of continent to the west. But with somewhat different from the parts and lying eastward below South America, which we then thought to form a separate and smaller continent, divided from the larger one by a frozen junction of Ross and Weddell seas. Though Bird has since disproved the hypothesis. In certain of the sandstones, dynamited and chiseled after boring revealed their nature. We found some highly interesting fossil markings and fragments, notably ferns, seaweeds, trilobites, crinoids, and such mollusks as linguae and gastropods, all of which seem real significance in connection with the region's primordial history. There's also a queer triangular striated marking about a foot in greatest diameter, which Lake pierced together from the three fragments of slate brought up from the deep glass aperture. These fragments came from a point to the westward near the Queen Alexander Range. And Lake, as a biologist, seemed to find their curious markings unusually puzzling and provocative. To my geological eye, it looked not unlike some of those ripple effects reasonably common in the sedimentary rocks. Since slate is no more a metamorphic formation into which a sedimentary stratum is pressed, and since the pressure itself produces odd distorting effects on any markings which may exist, I saw no reason for extreme wonder in the striated depression. On January 6, 1931, Lake Papady, Danforth, and all 6 of the students, 4 mechanics and I, flew directly over the South Pole and 2 of the Great Plains. Being forced down once by a sudden high wind, with which fortunately did not develop into a typical storm. This was, as the papers have stated, one of the several observation flights. During others of which we tried to discern new topographical features in areas unreached by previous explorers. Our early flights were disappointing in this latter respect. They afforded us some magnificent examples of the richly fantastic and deceptive mirages of the polar regions. Of which our sea voyage had given us some brief foretaste.